Hello there. If you're watching this, then I assume you already know that suspension is a key component to good racetrack setup. And you probably either modified your own car with aftermarket coilover suspension or dabbled in changing the suspension setup in a racing sim. When doing so, it's good to keep the fundamental trade-offs in mind, as well as so that you can create the best setup. But also, it's good to understand how the components of a typical suspension system work together, so that you avoid unintended consequences, such as, for example, having a car which starts off at low lateral accelerations, being understeered, but then transitioning into oversteer at higher lateral accelerations. So the whole point of having suspension in a vehicle is because we do not drive on perfectly flat roads. And because there are dips and bumps in roads and racetracks, the suspension is there for road vehicles for comfort reasons, and for race vehicles for improving the road holding capability. And so we already introduced this trade-off in the introduction, but the important thing here to say here is that it's mainly damping which is dominating this trade-off. And so passenger vehicles with a comfort focus typically have a damping ratio of, say, 0.3, whereas a race vehicle would have a damping ratio at least 2 times as high, 0.6, 0.7. Of course, it's when we get to damper tuning, you will see it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's just an approximate values. And if there is an increased suspension travel, so with increased suspension travel, it is possible to achieve a better road holding comfort compromise. If there is no suspension travel, such as in a go-kart, then the comfort would be bad, and the road holding on a very bumpy surface would also be bad, because the tire would be jumping into the air quite often. However, having mentioned a go-kart, it's important to mention the other trade-off which is dominated by the suspension stiffness. So if you think about a go-kart, it is that there's basically no suspension, and the only elasticity in the whole suspension is basically the frame stiffness, because everything, and all the rest is just in the tires. So if you think about a go-kart, the go-kart is very responsive and the body control is really good, but the road holding and comfort on bumpy roads would be really bad. So this is the other trade-off. And this is the one which is dominated by the spring and anti-roll bar stiffness. The stiffer the springs and anti-roll bars are, the quicker the car will take a set. That is to say, the quicker the car gets to its final roll angle, pitch angle, so that the driver doesn't need to wait for the vehicle to still reach its final roll angle. However, this is the trade-off. So what this means is that if you're driving on a very smooth racetrack, then for a fast response time and good body control, then you would want very stiff suspension. But if you're driving on very bumpy surface, such as, say, off-road rally, or even on track, if you're driving on a very bumpy track like Nürburgring, then you would want softer suspension than, say, on Spa or Silverstone. Another way to think about the trade-off in suspension stiffness is to remember that increased stiffness increases vehicle responsiveness, not just to driver inputs, but also to road inputs. And so it cuts both ways. When racing on a perfectly smooth track, the driver wants a vehicle which responds very quickly. So having the stiff suspension means that there's very little energy stored in the system, because for the same force, so say to control the body roll, a soft spring will end up storing a lot more energy than a stiff spring. And so it's not just bad for the delay time, say from when the body is flopping from one side to the other side. The increased energy also means that once it has flopped to the other side in response to the driver's countersteer, for example, by the time it arrives at the new roll angle, the body will have been rolling at a much higher velocity, which means kinetic energy. That then translates into increased dynamic tire load, which means a much more severe reaction from the vehicle if the driver does not anticipate the roll motion of the vehicle properly and time his or her steering wheel input. So all of this means that with softer suspension, the time that it takes for the body to roll is longer. The penalty for not anticipating it properly is higher, and so it's much easier to spin out in a softer vehicle than in a stiffer vehicle. So that's one. So on the very smooth track, you want the very stiff vehicle. The problem is if you're driving on a very bumpy track, then the bumps in the road also cause changes to the tire load variation, which then causes oversteer and understeer that the driver has to correct. So although the vehicle is just as responsive, the fact that the vehicle is very responsive to road inputs means that the driver just has a much busier time having to correct all these small oversteer and understeer events which occur due to the fact that the suspension is so stiff and the track is bumpy. An additional effect worth mentioning is the influence of suspension stiffness on camber angles, where stiffer typically means less changes to the camber angle. This is significant, especially for some suspension types, such as McPherson strut, which is a very often used type of suspension on the front axles of vehicles. So McPherson strut has many benefits. It is cheap and it is very good for packaging, and it is light. However, McPherson struts, especially when they are lowered, will show significant loss of negative camber when the vehicle body rolls. So in the chapter on tires, we discussed how some negative camber is very helpful for generating maximum lateral tire force. But if a lowered vehicle with McPherson strut rolls, then it is very likely that the front wheels will go into positive camber and positive camber, as we discussed in the chapter on tires, is definitely very bad for generating lateral tire force, as well as wearing out the outside tire shoulder. So if a certain car is only used on very flat racetracks, then besides the benefit of very quick reactions to the driver from the stiff suspension will also actually increase grip in the corners due to the fact that the negative camber angle is maintained by, for example, using very stiff anti-roll bars. However, the high stiffness is, as mentioned before, very bad for when the track becomes bumpy, and therefore, once again, it's a bit of a trade-off in grip for very flat racetracks and very bumpy racetracks. Hello there. In my day job, I create control software for active suspension systems, and with this channel, I aim to demystify racetrack setup, whether that's for sim racing or any other form of motorsport.